Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about how armed conflicts damage the environment in general terms and give you some historical context. And then Owen will look specifically at the situation in Ukraine and the types of environmental damage which we're seeing there. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, the Conflict and Environment Observatory is a UK charity, and we work to increase the protection of people and ecosystems from the impact of armed conflicts and military activities. So I'm going to talk initially about how wars impact the environment. So there's long been a cliche that the environment is a silent casualty of war and armed conflict. For many years, the environment has tended to get very little attention in conflict settings. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine has really changed that situation, and it's probably the best documented conflict in history in terms of environmental damage. Next slide, please. So when we think about the environment and warfare, we need to focus, or at least at the moment, we're focusing on quite a narrow part of that, but we need to understand the environment as a continuum. So how the environment and natural resources can help to fuel conflicts, for example, disputes over minerals, how the environment can be used and needs to be protected post-conflict during the peace, and also about how the environment is impacted during war itself. So that might be damage caused by war, or it might be through the weaponization of the environment. Next slide, please. So there are probably 6 key ways in which the environment can be damaged by war. One of them is around toxic hazards and pollution from damage to industrial and urban infrastructure. Next slide, please. The second is around the legacy of weapons and munitions. So that might be minefields, which might stop people accessing parts of the environment, or it could be pollution from explosives getting into the soil or into the water. Next slide, please. Another issue we see in a lot of conflicts is around human displacement. So where people move to can be impacted by increased population, so through use of water or other natural resources. Next slide, please. In many conflicts, for example, in DRC, we see how minerals and the extraction of minerals becomes part of a conflict and can help to fuel the conflict. So this creates money for armed groups, for example, to buy weapons to fight the government. Next slide, please. In a lot of conflicts, we see damage or disruption to important civilian infrastructure. So it might be water or waste infrastructure. And that obviously has environmental impacts, both in the area where it's damaged, but also for populations at large who no longer have access to these services. Next slide, please. And then finally, we quite often see the deliberate targeting of natural resources to cause environmental damage. So this is turning natural resources into a weapon. So for example, this is from Iraq in 2016, when Islamic State was setting fire to oil wells as a weapon of war and as a weapon of terror. Next slide, please. So why do we do what we do? So we collect environmental data and publicize it. And there are 4 key reasons why we do this. One is for advocacy. So to try and challenge this idea of the environment as a silent victim of conflicts. We gather data for assessment to inform remedial actions on the ground. We collect data for accountability purposes, even though at the moment the legal avenues for accountability are quite limited. And we also gather data to help strengthen norms to prevent damage in the future by informing legal or policy changes. Next slide, please. So I just want to look at a few historical cases of damage, just to give some perspectives on different types of harm. Slide, please. Okay, so if we look back to World War I, 100 years ago, we saw this huge level of industrial damage. Essentially, this was the first truly industrial conflict. 1.5 billion shells were fired by all the militaries present across all the fronts, so not just northern France, but also Italy and elsewhere. And what we see is that soil contamination is a problem even a century later, and that might be corrosion of unexploded ordnance and metal fragments. We see issues around organic compounds like explosives, many of which are toxic, and also chemical weapons residues as well. Next slide, please. Fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, and again, you had this high technology war where the US in particular was pulling in all sorts of technologies to try and defeat the Viet Cong in Vietnam. One of the things they used was chemical defoliants, which they sprayed across South Vietnam. The industrial processes they were using created a dioxin called TCDD, which was extremely dangerous to health and very persistent in the environment. And elsewhere, what we saw were these landscape level environmental impacts. So not just forest clearance through defoliants, but also attacks on agriculture, huge levels of cratering, and the use of napalm incendiary weapons to burn down forests. Next slide, please. Going forward again to Afghanistan and the Soviet occupation. And again, we saw the environment being deliberately targeted to undermine the Mujahideen fighters there. So we saw this systematic destruction of ancient irrigation systems, these huge impacts on agriculture. So livestock, a 50% decrease, 43,000 hectares of orchards were destroyed, and 3,000 of these irrigation systems were lost in what was essentially a scorched earth policy. Slide, please. Moving forward again to the Iran-Iraq war, this had a huge focus on oil refineries, wells, and pipelines. So it was the deliberate attacks on oil infrastructure, which we again saw in subsequent conflicts. Next slide, please. And then one probably made famous by the fact you had a huge amount of environmental damage, but also it was the first televised conflict, was the 1991 Gulf War in Kuwait. Next slide, please. So here we saw this very short war. It was just 5 weeks and 5 days long. But in that time, unexploded ordnance had covered 3,500 square kilometers, and millions had fled to neighboring countries. Again, oil was used as a weapon of war. More than 700 oil wells were blown up, which burnt more than 6 million barrels a day for up to 10 months. Oil lakes covered the desert, and you had plumes leaving this substance tarcrete over 1,000 square kilometers of the desert. Similarly, in the sea, 11 million barrels of oil from storage units and pipelines were spilled into the Persian Gulf, and this was at the time the largest oil spill in history. Next slide, please. Moving forward again to the late 90s, early noughties, you had the conflicts in the Balkans. So here we saw NATO forces, primarily US forces, attacking the infrastructure of former Yugoslavia, or Serbia as was. This included attacks on the Pančevo petrochemical plant. And the military purpose for these was never made particularly clear, but in the process, you had this huge environmental disaster with thousands of tons of hazardous substances released in the process into the Danube. In addition, we also saw the use of depleted uranium weapons in Bosnia in the mid-90s, and then later in Serbia, Kosovo, and Montenegro in 1999, which then triggered significant health concerns. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll hand over to Owen now to look at some of the contemporary impacts from historical cases.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Hello, everyone. I'm going to pick up on some of these historical cases and show how some of them are still current and have impacts decades or centuries even afterwards. This is an important and sober consideration for Ukraine, really. So back to World War I in France and Belgium, the battlefields are still contaminated, in particular from all of the artillery shelling, and this causes something called bomb turbation. This alters soil's physical structure and chemical composition. And alarmingly, some recent research shows that even in areas which were subject to relatively less intense artillery fire, these areas are still contaminated now. Looking away from land now and at the marine environment, where there has historically been huge amounts of munitions dumped at sea. This was not quite the problem solved that they thought it was at the time. With time, there has been corrosion, like we can see in these images, and increasingly leakage of these energetic pollutants into the marine environment. At the moment, this is of particular concern in the Baltic, where an estimated 300,000 tons of munitions have been dumped. Staying with munitions, unexploded ordnance causes environmental issues which last long into the future. This can be through degradation and leakage into soils and waters, but environmental exposure can also happen if unexploded ordnance which has been removed is destroyed in a poor way. For example, uncontrolled burning that we see here in the picture in Pilau. The process of removing mines may also radically alter the landscape, with the released land being turned over for intensive agriculture or the disturbed soils allowing the spread of invasive species. Additional problems occur when ordnance is moved, and we are increasingly seeing this with climate change, either through flooding or landslides, as we see with this 500-pound bomb in Vietnam. Now, in Ukraine, they say up to 1/3 of the land is potentially contaminated with mines and UXO, which is extraordinary, really. Let's look at an area over a long time. So back to Iraq and the Mesopotamian marshes, and their fate has been inextricably linked to war. This black and white image here is from declassified US spy satellite imagery. And by using this imagery, you can see how the marshes were drained and settlements like this were wiped off the map. There was a cultural kind of erasure of peoples who depended upon this unique natural environment, and it was replaced by battlefronts in the Iran-Iraq War and then by oil fields. The marshes played a key role in modulating the local climate, and now this is one of the areas suffering the most from climate change in the world, really. Relief from upstream is in short supply, and in part this is again owing to kind of weak environmental governance, which we can link back to conflicts in Iraq and Syria. In these kind of places, it's important to look ahead also, to make decisions based on what the climate changes are likely to be. To do this, we can use climate models, and I think these are going to be really important for informing a proper sustainable recovery in Ukraine. Okay, now moving on to some of the contemporary cases of environmental harm and war. Some examples from here can act as places Ukraine can learn lessons from, or maybe places where lessons can be taken from Ukraine and help there. One thing we always see in relation to wars is deforestation, although the exact dynamics vary from context to context. This image here is showing the scale of it in Myanmar, where there is widespread deforestation linked to financing the fighting, and also linked to complicated global supply chains. Often, deforestation is linked to other resource exploitation, as here in DRC, where a highly biodiverse and carbon-rich rainforest is clear-cut for artisanal gold mining. It's also not just forests that are important, but lots of smaller shrubs and woody vegetation can be just as significant, such as in Tigray in Ethiopia, where we saw conflict-driven vegetation loss of land which was previously restored. And with this kind of analysis, it's actually really important to say that we need to control for other factors like changes in rainfall or temperature, which affect vegetation growth. In Tigray, neither were abnormal, so we were able to confidently attribute that forest loss to the fighting. In Yemen, there is a significant problem with declining groundwater levels, despite increasing precipitate rainfall at the same time. By bringing in local context and knowledge, we were able to come with the hypothesis that these drops in groundwater were caused by a widespread uptake of solar energy and using that to pump groundwater. And that itself was a reaction to the energy crises because of the war. Onto a different context, but something definitely relevant to the Ukraine context, is the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh at the end of 2020, which at the time was unique with the degree to which the environment was part of the online information war. Some of this was legitimate, but lots of it was far-fetched. And so it was necessary to collect data, albeit a rapid assessment on fire frequency, so we could try and counter some of this disinformation. We've continued to monitor the situation here in the post-conflict phase, and we see a lot of forest loss associated with big construction projects by Azerbaijan, whilst at the same time the Azeri government is using claims of ecocide as the pretext for blockading the territory. So the environment is becoming politically important. So far, the other examples are all landscape scale changes happening over a wide area and longer time periods. But there are also significant discrete incidents of environmental harm nearly every day in different wars and conflict settings across the world. Here, an example of a large plume of sulfur dioxide from a sulfur stockpile in Iraq, and we were able to monitor this remotely. Oil spills are also a frequent occurrence, as here from a fuel storage facility in Derna in Libya. This was caused partly by the poor environmental governance in the post-conflict period. And now we can kind of look at this and see that maybe it was a warning sign for the tragic dam collapse that then happened last September. The point is that in these post-conflict spaces, environmental governance can be poor or non-existent. And this is why areas occupied in Ukraine since 2014 are particularly important to pay attention to. So I'm going to hand back over to Doug now to talk you through some climate and greenhouse gas issues.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, so Ukraine, since 2022, it's been the first time we have had journalists asking us about the greenhouse gas emissions from a conflict. So I just want to talk a little bit about military and conflict emissions. We'll come back to some of this a little bit later. So we do some work looking at the military greenhouse gas emissions, and the best estimate that we have, if you include fuel use, the energy that militaries buy in, and also the energy carbon produced in their supply chains, if you put it all together, we think that the military's would be responsible for around 5.5% of global emissions. And if they were a country, that would place them in between Russia and India, as you see from here. Next slide, please. So the problem is that this is an estimate. This is the best estimate that we have. And the key issue we have is a lack of data from militaries. They are not particularly good at recording their emissions, and they are even worse at reporting their emissions. And currently they are under very few obligations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to report their emissions. And so at the moment, we're having to kind of make estimates about how much they're producing. We have some data on the fuel that they use, some data on the energy that they use. We have very little data on their supply chains, and we have pretty much no data on warfighting activities of what they are emitting during conflict. Next slide, please. And while we focus quite a lot on emissions from conflict, it's important to remember that peacetime also generates a lot of military emissions. So, for example, NATO did an exercise last year, and it was estimated that just from the aviation fuel alone, it would be the equivalent emissions from 19,500 average EU cars being driven for a year. And this only came about because of concerns from German parliamentarians about the potential emissions. Next slide, please. So when we think about the emissions, what do they come from? So buildings, flying, driving tanks around, kind of the obvious ones. Also what we call like scope 2, so the energy they have to buy to heat buildings, for example. Then scope 3, which is their supply chains, so things that they buy and purchase and build. And then we start to think about, well, surely there needs to be a scope 3 plus, which is around the emissions from conflict. And this can be almost anything from landscape fires, from damage to infrastructure, those oil facilities we see that get blown up, but also the costs of reconstruction and recovery. And it's actually those reconstruction and recovery costs which look to be almost 50% of emissions in the two conflicts which have been looked at in some detail so far. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll hand you back to Owen to talk more about the impacts which we're seeing in Ukraine.
Yep, thanks, Doug. So yes, on to Ukraine now, and it's fair to say the environmental impacts have been colossal and widespread. And thanks to the efforts of many people, the most monitored of any war in history. I'm going to give a very high-level overview of the impacts to different environmental themes before going a bit into how we look at it all and analyze it at CEOBS. So there's been a significant amount of conflict pollution associated with military activities themselves, with large explosions at ammunition storage sites, such as on the left here, a purpose-built facility, but also at field storage sites. And those are likely more environmentally harmful because they have no engineering around them, and they will release high concentrations of heavy metals and energetic materials into the environment. There have also been dozens of attacks on air bases, naval ports, military production or repair factories, and across the front lines, huge volumes of destroyed military hardware. The example on the right here shows the aftermath of a destroyed fuel convoy. And this has a big physical impact on soils and the landscape, especially from widespread trenches and earthworks, especially along the frontline areas. Now, there have been harmful incidents at hundreds of industrial facilities through deliberate and incidental damage, as well as disruptions. As you can see here, they've been spread across the country, but particularly focused in areas which are or were under occupation. I'm going to be showing you quite a lot of maps similar to this one. And it's important to say these only actually cover the first 12 months of the war. But I encourage you to look at these in more detail. The excellent cartography of Matt, who works for Zoe Environment Network, and these are all in the executive summary of a report for the OSCE, which has just been released on our website. So please go have a look. We do have the data for the second year as well. And what we do know is that if we were to redo the visualizations, we would see a significant increase in the number on this map. So the images here show the diversity of facilities attacked. So a foam production plant, and a nitrate tank in a chemical works, a fuel and lubricant storage facility, a power plant, a food factory. And I'm sure you can appreciate from such a range of facilities, there will be a diverse mix of chemicals released into the air, into the soil, and into surface and groundwaters. This is particularly concerning in Ukraine because of the proximity of these facilities to people. Many are within densely populated urban areas. There have been limited monitoring of these exposures because of the war, and in general of environmental performance at the industrial facilities which are operating normally. So some objects are particularly hazardous, such as the substation on the left here, which if they are from a certain era will likely leak PCBs, which are a class of highly carcinogenic chemical compounds that stay in the environment for a long time. Renewable energy generating sites, including hydropower plants, have also been impacted, and many solar and wind sites are still under occupation. Now, explosive weapons have devastated the built environment, impacting water and sanitation networks, air and land quality, and generating huge volumes of debris. This map shows the scale of attacks on human settlements. Every circle is an attack, and the larger the circle, the more documented incidents of destruction there are. Unfortunately, we are now quite familiar with images like this of destroyed, bombed and burnt out urban areas. These have generated immense debris volumes that have placed overwhelming pressure on Ukraine's solid waste management capacity, and these may be mixed in with unexploded ordnance or asbestos. So here's an example of the scale of that damage in Mariupol. Every coloured pixel here indicates likely damage to a building at that location. And it's important to reiterate that the environmental risks from this damage are from everything that is destroyed, not just the kind of industrial areas and sites. Urban areas have also undergone changes in air quality. We've seen lots of very localized, very polluting events, such as burning fuel storage depots. But actually, at the kind of average level, air quality has improved in many cities, thanks to because of the reduced economic activity. And we can see an example of that in this graphic. Now onto the rural environment, where much of the fighting has happened. We have seen lots and lots of landscape fires. Again, just in the first year of the war, something like the equivalent of 1.4 million football pitches were burnt. This poses many future risks, actually, from lack of access to managed land, from reduced firefighting capacity, and from the risks from unexploded ordnance. There have been severe impacts on forests and forest management. It's estimated that it will take at least 60 to 80 years for forestry to return to its pre-war condition. Now, a lot of these fires and the fighting have affected nationally and regionally important habitats and protected areas through a real diversity of direct impacts and many indirect impacts. We've seen widespread damage to lots of agricultural industry sites, causing pollution. We've seen damage to crops and grain storage on a massive scale. And we've also seen damage to irrigation systems, agricultural buildings, such as those storing fertilizers and pesticides, which we can see blow up like on the images here. And ultimately, together, all of this has impacted livelihoods, agricultural livelihoods, and had an impact on international food security, as well as causing pollution. Now, onto water. There's been widespread damage and disruption to water and hydro energy infrastructure, causing pollution, flooding, and interrupting power supplies. Water has been weaponized in this war. Dams in particular, used for military or strategic purposes, not only Kakhovka, but also the Irpin Dam, the Oskil Dam, Karlivka, and there are many others, actually. There's also been physical damage, de-energization of water supply, large and small, as well as water treatment systems, which have triggered discharges and spills and leaks into the environment. Next, moving on to coastal and marine environments, there have been many attacks on naval facilities and vessels, civilian shipping, and coastal settlements and ports. For example, in the Danube recently, lots of attacks in places like Reni, whilst along beaches themselves, many sensitive coastal habitats have been damaged by mines, by cratering, by fires or fortifications, or even military sites in very close proximity. So some marine ecosystems are at risk from chemical pollution, but also acoustic pollution. For example, here, Zernov's Filiophora field in the Black Sea. Meanwhile, shipping areas and fisheries have been altered, modifying or displacing existing patterns and pressures on ecosystems. And there's quite a lot of evidence now for deaths of Black Sea cetaceans and dolphins associated with perhaps naval sonar. Finally, onto the nuclear side of things, we've seen the unprecedented occupation of current and former nuclear generating sites, highlighting the real threats to radiation safety from war. However, important though they are, the Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia are not the only stories here. There are lots of other nuclear installations that have been affected and sites with nuclear material. And for example, there are lots of medical and industrial radioactive sources that remain unaccounted for. Okay, so that's a rapid overview of all the different types of issues. And very quickly, I will talk about how that harm actually occurs. So, there can be discrete incidents which cause pollution or impact an ecosystem service or environmental service. For example, here at the Hubyanka fuel depot, we can identify all the damaged tanks, the damage to the adjacent cropland, by looking at satellites and social media. There are also places, larger facilities, where there have been multiple incidents, especially those close to front lines, where we need to account for all the damage and all the incidents. The example given here is at the Azot Association in Severodonetsk, where there was a long battle for control, and it's one of the largest factories producing fertilizers in Europe. Then we need to look at where there have been many discrete incidents in close proximity over large areas. And the environmental harm needs to be considered together. So, for example, in Kyiv Oblast, many incidents happened at a similar time, and this caused a severe air quality episode in March 2022. And actually, this was an interesting one because we could measure it from the ground because there's a network of low-cost sensors. Then we have the catastrophic events, the most obvious example of which is the Kakhovka Dam, where we saw flooding downstream, generating multiple pollution risks, as many hazardous objects, industrial and military, were flooded, also from legacy contamination. These were either deposited along in the flooded area or washed out to sea, into the Black Sea, where they likely contributed to the big giant algal blooms we saw, which further kind of degraded the quality of the Black Sea for marine life. Upstream, of course, there's this now massive area, which is the former reservoir bed, and this has different environmental risks, like from legacy pollution, from unexploded ordnance. Maybe invasive species may take over, or there may be food safety issues if there is agriculture on that land. Environmental harm may occur in a more diffuse way, so at the landscape level. So again, let's look. An easy way to show this is through craters, which a lot of the front lines in Ukraine and agricultural areas look like this image here from Kharkiv. And I like to show this one with a similar image taken in the 70s in Vietnam, and they're still undergoing mine clearance at this location in Vietnam. So it's, again, quite a sober thought that this clear up will take decades. The environmental impacts will be there for decades. Finally, there are the slow burn environmental changes. Perhaps the most significant example in Ukraine is the slow flooding of mines in the Donbass since 2014, exacerbated since 2022 as more have been abandoned and pumping has stopped. As these mines fill with water, and we can see that they are doing this from space, they bring mine waters contaminated with hazardous materials towards the surface, towards the water table, where they will then contaminate wells and rivers, and in some places this is forecast to happen very soon. So essentially, with all of that harm of environmental impacts I've described, we need to also understand the environmental conditions pre-2022 and all the various legacies from heavy industry, so we can properly understand the impact of conflict. Okay, now I'll very quickly, because time is running away, just describe how we try to document some of this and collect this data at CEOBS. The environment is big. Harm can take many different forms, and we've tried to be as conscious of all of this as possible in designing our database, which collects data on discrete incidents, in which we undertake remote environmental assessments for these incidents. And this has been the main focus of our work since the invasion, and a lot of it's kind of not publicly available, but there's lots of detail there. Essentially, what we do if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, is we find all the potential sites of environmental harm, of discrete incidents, and we try and work out the most significant of those. We try rank them by severity to help prioritize ground action. And at the same time, we're saving all this information, we're archiving it for any accountability purposes. Essentially what the data is it's a combination of, well, it's all the information we can find online. So that can be from social media or mass media, videos, photos, testimony. It can be from all different kinds of satellite data. And what we do is we pull that all together. We do lots of verifications. We also look at not just the immediate impact, but also months, now years later. And we look at the site history as well. And we pull all that together to do an environmental assessment, which I'll skip over the next few slides, I think. Anyway, all of this data in the database is kind of central to our various reports and publications and advocacy work. And what we've been trying to do more of recently in the last few months is more training to actually help progress some of this information from being remote to being useful on the ground and informing good ground assessments. And with that, I will pass back over to Doug to briefly chat about conflict emissions.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, just to come back to this question, next slide, please. So we saw the slide earlier about this scope 3+ and what the emissions might be from a conflict. And Ukraine is the first time there's been any attempt to comprehensively estimate the emissions from a conflict. And so just to illustrate some of those ideas we had around this scope 3+, this is one example of landscape fires. So as Owen mentioned, landscape fires have affected an area of around 1 million football pitches just in the first year of a conflict. Next slide, please. We've also seen the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, which again created significant emissions. And obviously these were extraterritorial emissions beyond Ukraine, but still linked to the conflict. Next slide, please. In the Black Sea, an oil and gas platform, BK1, has been burning since June 2022, continues to burn today, and this has generated a huge volume of emissions. Next slide, please. Similarly, when we look beyond Ukraine, the closure of Ukrainian airspace has caused displacement of a lot of flights, also the closure of Russian airspace. So for example, flights from Helsinki to Beijing were diverted a huge distance, generating more emissions than would otherwise have been the case. Next slide, please. So our colleagues at Initiative for Greenhouse Gas Accounting in War have been working on an ongoing basis to estimate the emissions from the conflict. And right now, after 18 months, they see that the emissions are about equivalent to the annual emissions of a country like Belgium. They've had to develop the methodologies because this has never been done before, and the process is ongoing. So it'll be interesting to watch other conflicts also coming up with emissions estimates. And ultimately, we will in future question the carbon cost of conflict alongside the environmental cost, civilian cost, and economic costs. Next slide, please. And I think that's us. So